Former Beatle, John Lennon, has made a great influence on the world through his actions as an artist and anti-war activist. His legacies of music and peace promotion live on today through the minds of all inspired by him, his music, and his message of peace. John Lennon was born into a world of war. It was the night of October 9, 1940, in the city of Liverpool, England. There was the sound of air raid sirens, and World War II German warplanes were flying overhead. Then there was the sound of bombs hitting the ground with deafening explosions. And in the Oxford Street Maternity Hospital was a woman named John Lennon. She was giving birth to a person that would become a musical sensation and one of the most well-known faces in rock history. She was giving birth to John Lennon.
No hell below us.
John Lennon was born not only into a difficult world, but into a difficult relationship between his mother and father. John Lennon's mother had various affairs, and Lennon's parents split up, causing him to live with his Aunt Mimi. It is from these broken roots that Lennon derived many of his powerful song lyrics. While living with his Aunt Mimi, Lennon went to school at Quarry Bank, where he had a group of friends. There, Lennon began discovering rock and roll. He listened to Americans such as Elvis Presley and Bill Haley. Eventually, Lennon decided he didn't only want to listen to music, he wanted to make it. So, Lennon sent money away to get a cheap guitar so he could learn to play it. With some of his schoolmates, John Lennon formed a band called the Quarrymen. At one of the band's many performances, Lennon was introduced to Paul McCartney. Paul was an excellent guitar player, so Lennon asked Paul to play in his band. Lennon continued playing in his band, but also started going to art college, where he met Cynthia Powell. In February of 1958, George Harrison joined the band. Because Lennon was no longer in the Quarry Bank school, he decided to change the band's name. He decided on the name The Beatles as a pun on another band, The Crickets. However, sadly, on July 15, 1958, Lennon's mother was run over by an off-duty policeman on her way to visit him. Lennon's grief was very intense, and this death would greatly further influence his later music. On August 18, 1962, a time when you could purchase 1 gallon of gas for 31 cents, Ringo Starr joined the band, and with John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, the Beatles were complete. Then, on August 23, 1962, John Lennon and his love from art school, Cynthia Powell, were married. The following year, Cynthia gave birth to Julian Lennon. The Beatles began touring around the world. After a tour in France, the Beatles traveled to America, where 3,000 screaming fans awaited them. They played in New York and Washington, D.C., and 2 weeks later they returned to England. But then, Lennon and Powell's relationship began fading, and in November of 1968, Lennon and Powell divorced. John Lennon's love life was not over yet, however, because on March 20th, 1969, he married Yoko Ono, an artist Lennon had first met in 1966. After their wedding, Lennon and Ono held a peace protest called a bed-in, where they stayed in bed for an entire week. Lennon and Ono would later have a child, named Sean, on John's 35th birthday in 1975. Now it seemed the Beatles were breaking apart, and finally, on December 31st, 1970, the Beatles split up. The Beatles were no longer the Beatles, and the dream was over. During the time when the Beatles were first on the rise, a war was stirring in Vietnam. Starting in 1959 and later ending in 1975, the Vietnam War was another major influence on John Lennon's life. The war was between North and South Vietnam, and this conflict between the nations had been going on for some time, even before the start of the Vietnam War. America would become involved with the war, and this would affect the country greatly. The war was very unpopular, especially with the American public, and this would spark a peace movement, the likes of which the world has never known. From the Buddhist barbecues of 1963 to the Kent State shootings of 1970, the peace movement would greatly affect the Vietnam War, prompting an early American troop withdrawal from Vietnam. The peace movement included a vast majority of American college students. Many organizations were even formed on college campuses for speaking about the war. The peace movement did affect the Vietnam War in a brutal manner. Beginning in May of 1963, the Buddhist crisis was a very horrific protest in Vietnam. During this protest, Buddhist monks would immolate or burn themselves in front of news reporters to protest the war. Aside from hitting hard in Vietnam, the peace movement would hit hard in America. On April 30th, 1970, the Kent State Massacre took place. After students burned the Kent State University's ROTC building in protest of the war, National Guard troops were sent to the Kent State campus. 4 students were killed in the crossfire, 2 who had participated in the protest, and 2 who were just walking on their way to class. This massacre would prompt more than 400 colleges to shut down, and would be remembered for years after its occurrence. The peace movement also affected troops returning from Vietnam. James Wright, a Vietnam veteran, is quoted as saying, "I was treated very badly upon my return. I was spat upon at the airport. I had my service war ribbons ripped from my uniform, and was beat up when I returned to my neighborhood I grew up in San Francisco. My friends from kindergarten would have nothing to do with me. I was constantly called a baby killer, rapist, murderer, and the ilk. Of course I was none of those things, nor are any of my fellow vets." John Lennon acted as a proponent of peace, holding bet-ins and also starting a worldwide peace campaign where he had billboards saying, "War is over, if you want it, Merry Christmas, John and Yoko," posted in 11 countries around the world, including New York, Tokyo, Rome, Athens, Amsterdam, London, Paris, Toronto, and many others. Aside from showing his feelings on the Vietnam War through peace protests, John Lennon expressed his feelings on the Vietnam War through his music. Lennon wrote many songs about peace, but one song, "Give Peace a Chance," would become the national anthem of the entire peace movement. This song would personify Lennon's message of peace, and it is still played today. John Lennon's radical peace activism did not go unnoticed by the FBI. The FBI began keeping files on Lennon, and even began illegally wiretapping his phone. The FBI began following Lennon and tried to remove him from the country. The 60s were a time of radical activism in America, not only for peace, but also for civil rights. This radical activism of the 60s would prompt 3 assassinations that would upset the country. The civil rights movement would be the cause of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a black pastor, in 1968. This environment of the 60s would also prompt the assassination of our 35th president, John F. Kennedy, in 1963, and his brother Bobby Kennedy in 1968.
And I can remember, and I was probably in 4th or 5th grade when Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated. And I can remember seeing they had a special news flash bulletin on the TV, and my first thought was, geez, I wonder who they've killed now.
Mm-hmm. On February 8, 1980, 5 years after the end of the Vietnam War, John Lennon was outside of his apartment building, the Dakota, in New York City. Also outside of the Dakota was a man named Mark David Chapman. This man was about to murder John Lennon. As Lennon entered the Dakota, Chapman shot him in the back, and the life of one of the most well-known faces in rock history ended. Though John Lennon may be dead in a physical sense, he is still alive in spirit. Lennon has created many different types of legacies. Lennon's legacy of music is one of his greatest. His song "So This Is Christmas" is one of the most played Christmas songs, and the music video for his song "Imagine" has been viewed nearly 20 million times on YouTube. Lennon's song "Imagine" is traditionally played during the New Year's celebrations in New York City, one of the most widely recognized New Year's celebrations, and it is still used as a representation of peace today. Along with this music being played, it has also inspired many bands that carry Lennon's legacies. One of the singers from the band Queen said that John Lennon was probably one of the greatest rock stars of all time. John Lennon's legacies are not only through his music, but also through his being. Lennon is featured on a commercial for a laptop, an invention that was not even around before Lennon's death. Also, in New York City, across from the Dakota, is a section of Central Park called Strawberry Fields that is dedicated to Lennon. Also, Ben & Jerry's has made an ice cream flavor in memory of Lennon called Imagine World Peace. John Lennon also made the legacy of fans around the world. On the anniversary of Lennon's death, mourners flocked to New York City where they sing songs and mourn over Lennon's death. John Lennon's second wife, Yoko Ono, also carried on Lennon's legacies by continuing to spread his message of peace through the Imagine Peace movement. Born into a world of war, John Lennon was a very influential person that made many different types of legacies. By his actions as a Beatle in the late 50s and 60s, Lennon made legacies of music. By acting as a peace activist during the Vietnam War, Lennon made legacies of peace. John Lennon has made a great influence on the world through his actions as an artist and anti-war activist. His legacies of music and peace promotion live on today through the minds of all inspired by him, his music, and his message of peace.